All right, it's 4 o'clock. Good afternoon and welcome. We'd like to welcome everyone to the Oral History launch event, Diversity in the Legislature. I am Natalia Vicente, the Acting State Archivist and Division Chief at the California Secretary of State's Office at the State Archives here. And today we have a virtual event, which is very exciting. It's a conversation with a question and answer session. And we are joined today by the Honorable Kevin Mori, the Honorable Richard Polanco, and the Honorable Floyd Mori, talking about their experiences in the legislature. This event is a partnership with the University of California, Berkeley's Oral History Center of the Bancroft Library, with our moderator this evening, Dr. Todd Holmes. But first, let me share a little bit of information about the California State Archives if you are unfamiliar with us, or this is the first time you're joining our programming. The California State Archives, we were created by California's first state law on January 5th, 1850. We are a critical part of California's government process by preserving the state's history and its people for over 173 years. The California State Archives collects, protects, and provides access to historical records of all three branches of California's state government, as well as some local government and private donations documenting California's rich and diverse history. We hold over 350 million records, and we proudly are one of the largest state and territorial archive collections in the United States. The collection holds records from pre-statehood, prior to 1850, and we continually receive records today. Our website, you'll find some information on the oral history program. Since 1986, the California State Archives has administered a legislatively established oral history program. Interviews are conducted with individuals who have had a significant role in California state government. And now I would like to introduce an individual who I personally admire through her continued accomplishments and who continually shapes California state history. We are so fortunate that we have such a huge advocate here at the Secretary of State's office who values education, history, and the resources that we provide at the archives. I'm pleased to introduce California's own Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Weber.
Well, thank you so very much, Natalia, and welcome to our panelists who are with us today. When I became Secretary of State about 3 years ago, one of the exciting things that I inherited was the archives. Folks think about the Secretary of State in terms of elections and business filings and those kinds of things. But I got excited over the archives, having spent the last 50 years working as a professor, as an instructor and an administrator at San Diego State University. It has always been in my heart and my spirit as I was in the legislature to try to educate my colleagues about the greatness of the state, the greatness of this nation, and our unique responsibility, not only to ourselves, but to the world. So when I see these kinds of things, it's amazing. We have done some great things in the archives, and I hope you will take advantage of it. So often we think it's just a place with a lot of old things in it, but then a tremendous number of listening opportunities that you have to really hear from the history of California, and it should make you really proud and engaged. I want to thank Berkeley for joining us today, for being a part of this. They've been a part of other projects of ours, and so we're just excited over the fact that California has such greatness. We have not only our archives, we have our universities that are second to none. We have so many things going on in California, and we're proud of California and what we have to offer. I was once in a hearing recently in Washington, and we were talking about fighting for justice and the voting rights. And I said, well, my philosophy is we're going to fight till hell freezes over, and then I'm going to put on my ice skates and fight some more. And someone laughed and said, ice skates in California? You don't have snow in California. I had to remind them, California is a rich state because it has everything. We do have mountains, we do have rivers and lakes, we have cities, huge cities, we have farmland. California, if you want anything, it has it all. And so I'm really proud of the fact that we have some trailblazers with us today who are going to share their experience. Having been a legislator, I know the experience of being a legislator, it changes your life forever, and it makes you a unique individual in terms of how you see the world and the contributions you make. So I want to welcome the legislators who are with us today. I'm looking forward to this conversation, and thank you so very much for giving California such a rich history and basically serving us in such a high manner. So thank you very much for being with us today, and I appreciate all you've done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Just a housekeeping item before we start this evening. As I mentioned earlier, this is a Q&A featured chat session today. So if you have any questions, please feel free to place your questions in the chat during our discussion today. We will be looking at them and addressing them at the end. And then I'm pleased to introduce and actually welcome back, because we've had other events with UC Berkeley here from the Oral History Center, Dr. Todd Holmes.
Thank you, Natalia, and Secretary State Weber. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to participate in this event and have a chance to talk with our three honorees. Joining us today is the Honorable Kevin Mori, who was a member of the State Assembly from 1994 to 1998, and the Senate from 1998 to 2006. Also joining us is the Honorable Richard Polanco, who served in the Assembly from 1986 to 1994, and the Senate from 1994 to 2002. And lastly, joining us is the Honorable Floyd Mori, who served at both on the City Council and as mayor of the city of Pleasanton before being a member of the State Assembly from 1975 to 1980. Senator Murray and Polanco, Assemblymember Mori, welcome, and thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
Good to be here.
Thank you for having us.
Well, your orals histories, which we celebrate the release of today, offer an in-depth look at your time in state government. And collectively, it's a period covered as almost 30 years of service, which is a period that saw tremendous change in California. Now, I'd like to dive into our discussion and start off by touching on our theme largely for this talk, which is diversity in the legislature. Now, this is an area in which all three of you have worked on, and both during your years in government and after. Now, thinking back on your years of service in the state legislature, maybe we should start about asking what you recall about diversity and representation in California government. Assemblymember Mori, I'd like to start with you. You began serving in 1975, which I think at that time only had 2 legislative caucuses. Tell us what you remember from your time.
Well, I was a young guy at that time, and coming up to the legislature was kind of a daunting thing, and there were very few minority legislators there. Fortunately, my office was next to Art Torres, Hispanic, and my seat was right behind Willie Brown, and everybody knows who Willie Brown is. So it was a great experience for me to get acquainted with just a minority group. There were 2 Asians that got elected that year, myself and another Paul Benai from Gardena. But we had to work together as a total group. So I worked a lot with Arthur Torres and with Willie Brown on some of the things that affected minorities.
Senator Polanco, you began serving in the Assembly in 1986, but before that also worked on the staff of legislators like Richard Alatorre, who helped found the Chicano Caucus in 1973. Tell us what you recall about representation in state government.
Well, elected in 1986, it was a handful of Latinos, few Asians, predominantly Anglo male dominated. And it was not a true reflection of what California was becoming. And so in 1986, several things occurred that helped propel the change. And one of them was the IRCA, the Immigration Act, that allowed for immigrants to wait for 5 years. You did not become a public charge. You could start the process to become naturalized. Well, that propelled and created the opportunity to expand because of the citizenship programs. And I'll elaborate on those further on. But my experience was, you can count them on one hand. You had Art Torres, you had Alatorre. When I was there, you also had Gloria Molina. You also had Joe Montoya. About 7 of us that were present and participating in this, what is now the 4th largest economy in the world. And so it was a real eye-awakening to see the lack of diversity.
Thank you. Senator Murray, you joined the Assembly in 1994, but also had the distinction of actually being the only member of the legislature to serve with your father, the late Willard Murray, who was, of course, active in local and state politics since probably the 1960s. What do you remember about representation in California government during your time?
Well, during, if you go back even to before I was elected, it was, as described by, my two colleagues here, relatively slim. Over the years, it particularly had been static for all. There was always a person or two people or maybe even five, but it was always static, and they always came from districts where, in most cases, districts where there was a majority of whatever that ethnicity is. In Los Angeles had the same, 4 Black districts. I got elected in the year after, I think, that Senator Polanco, as chair of the Latino caucus, brought a huge number of Latinos up. And again, I think the diversity, we should all sort of pay homage to Senator Polanco, because he figured out one thing that no one else seemed to have really tried out before, which is he figured out that minorities could run and win in districts that were not necessarily majority minority or majority of that ethnicity. If you had a good base and you had a profile that it was thought could cross over, however you want to define that, he ran candidates there and they won. So, when I got there, we had Martha Escudia and Luis Caldera and a slew of people. And I think, frankly, Senator Polanco, that was the genius of you. And it was a little bit harder for African Americans to do that for all sorts of reasons. But now they are starting to win in districts that are not majority African American. So it had expanded broadly, particularly in terms of Latino power when I got there.
Todd, if I might mention, my district happened to be way back in 75, probably 90% white. So I was a very non-traditional kind of a elected office in that area. But what happened was that the rest of the state realized, aha, there's an Asian legislator up there. So it became my duty, so to speak, to represent the Korean community, the Chinese community, the Filipinos, and the Pacific Islanders. And it was to me, a big blessing to be able to serve a broad, wide group of people, not just my district, but throughout the state of California.
Absolutely. Well, on that same topic of representation, today, if we look at the legislature, it's probably the most diverse it's ever been. And then many have pointed to term limits as one of the primary factors in this dramatic change. I wanted to ask, what are your thoughts on term limits in the legislature and their role in creating a more diverse body? Senator Polanco, let's start with you.
Well, term limits definitely had an impact. Coupled with that, term limits in and of itself was not sufficient. If I mentioned in 1986, IRCA was adopted. What the Latino caucus was doing right after, around the time of term limits, was realizing that we needed to naturalize. And so we created citizenship pathways and programs where we actually budgeted $10 million to fund nonprofits. We funded community-based agencies, labor groups that wanted to institutionalize a process to help immigrants become naturalized Americans. And so when we coupled the immigration naturalization, of which I think we had reported over 500,000 in a period of time, at least some of the studies validate that, then coupled with reapportionment, coupled with term limits, it was prime. And if you remember back then also, a lot of the growth took place at the height of 187, the anti-immigration attacks upon the minority ethnic communities in California. And so in that period of time, subscribing to the notion that we could run candidates in non-ethnic minority seats which we did. And in 1992, I think it was, that particular class of Marta Luis Caldera, Grace Napolitano, Joe Baca, Hilda Solis, and Diane Martinez, all in one election, all in one. So it really magnified the diversity and changed the presence of California's political public policy institution, which is the greatest one, in my opinion, in the world. And so, yes, term limits did play a big role.
Thank you for that. Senator Murray, what is your view on the role?
Well, I'm not a big fan of term limits, but what it did in terms of diversity is it negated the power of incumbency. So if you're trying to change the nature and add some diverse input, whether the demographics have changed or not, there is certainly a power of incumbency. And, in fact, some of those, non-ethnic politicians were great politicians and took care of their constituencies. Kenny Hahn down in Los Angeles was beloved by his district well after his district became overwhelmingly African-American. Assemblyman Floyd down in the South Bay here in LA, had a huge ethnic population, but he was well loved by most of them. So term limits took away that power of incumbency, and that, coupled with immigration reform and the tactical things, frankly, that Senator Polanco did in looking at places where there was an ethnic base, but not necessarily a majority of an ethnicity, and finding the right candidates who could appeal to them, changed it. So taking away the power of incumbency was a very significant thing.
Assembly Member Mori, now term limits took effect well after you left office, but from your vantage point as one who worked not just in the state, but also on the federal level, I mean, what's from that purview, what role do you think term limits played?
Well, in my case, my predecessor, who had served 20 years, passed away in office. And so I was elected in a special election. So in this case, I was able to do something that probably I would not have been able to do had there been term limits and the political machine had prepared people to run for office. But there's the pluses and the minuses. I think the pluses are that we know what the structure is. We know when offices are going to change. And so I think we as minorities particularly can begin to look and train and involve and engage young people to take our place and work with them in developing a good constituency.
Well, I wanted to switch gears just a little bit to ask you actually to reflect a bit on your time of service personally. And one of the questions I had was, looking back, what are one of the things that you're most proud of from your time in the legislature? And Senator Murray, let's start with you.
Well, I did what I think are a lot of interesting things. And while I sort of, and this is the other thing about having diversity, is you want a diversity of opinions and you want diversity of approaches. But one of the things, frankly, I'm most proud of in this context is that I did things that were not just diversity oriented. So I did things in parks, I did things in the environment, I did things in tech. And, when I got there, particularly people in the third house, the lobbying corps, expected me to do traditional ethnic politics. And the benefit of having a diverse, body, the benefit of a growing, Latino population in the legislature, the benefit of having, an African-American speaker in Willie Brown is I didn't have to limit myself to just, quote, diversity-oriented issues. So Martha Scooty and I worked a lot on environmental stuff and a lot on tech stuff. So I'm really proud of the idea that I got to do other stuff that I think benefits the state, and I hope benefits the state beyond what is normally considered an ethnic issue.
Assemblymember Mori, how about you? What are one of the things you're most proud of from your time in service?
You know, there are a couple things. I am an economist by profession. I was a professor of economics prior to going into the assembly, and I've always been interested in international trade. So at that time was the time of major expansion of Far Eastern countries and their economies. And we as a state, even at that time, we were what, seventh or eighth largest economy in the world. And we had not really set up a mechanism to deal with these international businesses coming into our state. So one of the things that we created, I did a bill that created the Office of International, California Office of International Trade, which gave, you know, some meat to what California was, not just being there. The other thing that I would mention is that, you know, I had an intern once that brought to me the California Code book, and we turned to the subject of rape. And rape was defined as an act committed against a woman other than your wife. Now think about that. That meant that a husband could do anything he wanted with his wife. And so we introduced some legislation to look at this issue. And I think the matter of spousal abuse has become a very major issue over the past several decades. And I think our focus on changing that language from other than your wife to include all women, not just other women. So that was another piece of legislation I felt very proud of.
Senator Polanco, how about you? What are one of the things you're most proud of from your time of service?
There are several, but the one that stands out that is to this day having a tremendous impact is the California Voting Rights Act. I authored that bill. That bill was authored because I believe that ethnic minority communities who were not given the opportunity to elect candidates of their choice in the at-large district. So you had municipalities, school boards, where 80–90% of the population is ethnic minority, and yet the powers to be do not reflect that. And so that has had a tremendous impact. Over 120 municipalities, I believe, and school boards have implemented the California Voting Rights Act. But very early on, back then, I'm proud of the hearings I was conducting on AIDS and HIV, when it was not very popular, when it was really looked upon very negatively. As a result of those hearings, we created the hospice care licensing requirements, ultimately the Medi-Cal reimbursements. I think the greatest experience, and Kevin touched upon it, it's like you can legislate beyond just California and have an impact. Los Alamos had a contract with the UC Regents. Those employees were under the Regents' California law. And when the speaker contacted us and said, hey, when are you going to stop colonizing us over here? To my surprise, I said, what are you talking about? Make a long story short, many of the issues of lack of upward mobility of qualified ethnic minorities, the business procurement, lack thereof. Make a long story short, I introduced legislation because of the contract that came from the Department of Energy. They became PURPA. They became eligible under California PURPA state personnel. And so that's just another example. But to what I really have enjoyed is the ability and the opportunity and the privilege to really make a difference. The Cesar Chavez holiday that was attempted many or several times, we were successful in and I pride myself not just for the holiday, but what it really means and what the real emphasis and purpose of that measure is for us to give back to community. And on that day, you have schools, you have community groups doing community service and being a service to people and being a service to the community that continues the legacy of a great leader in Cesar Chavez.
Thank you. I want to just remind our audience that if you have questions for our honorees, you can put those in the question and answer, the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I wanted to ask you, there seems to be obviously no shortage of critiques about government. And from your experience, all three of you, what are some of the biggest misconceptions people have of government and politics? Assemblymember Mori, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think, I am a farm boy. I grew up on a farm. I'm just an ordinary guy, and I got elected to office in California. And when I got to the state legislature, I found that to be true. My neighbor, who was my next door to me, he was just a nice, ordinary guy who had a profession. That, legislators really reflect what the people are. You find, and I felt that the integrity of legislators was probably one notch above what the general citizenship was. So, I was very proud and pleased to be serving both, on both sides of the aisle with people that had high integrity, that people had the interests of their constituency in mind, but also they were willing to listen to you to see what interests and issues you wanted to solve. So, the camaraderie, later on, I spent some years in Washington, D.C., and my colleagues in the Assembly who were now members of Congress, Bill Thomas, Jerry Lewis, Norm Mineta, some of these folks, Nancy Pelosi, you've heard of her, haven't you?
Oh, yeah.
She wasn't a legislator, but she was a very important part of our Northern California political process. Well, that camaraderie existed, and they helped me. And Democrats couldn't understand why Jerry Lewis or Bill Thomas would even let me in their office, but they were very helpful and helped me get legislation passed, as did the others that I knew.
Senator Polanco, what do you believe is some of the biggest misconceptions?
Well, I can only draw from my experience along with what the Assemblyman has just stated. There are going to be issues where you need to reach across the aisle. Case in point, when my liberal friends were attacking the gardeners because of the noise on the leaf blowers. What a knee-jerk reaction to ban them. Had it been corporate America, we would give them a 3-year plan to go out and assist in creating the alternatives. And so what I see today, unfortunately, not so much, I don't think, at the state level, but at the national level, a very polarizing level of government and lack thereof of service. Having said that, I give credit to the administration for being able, nevertheless, to bring forth the kind of what I would refer to and what we would refer to are the bread and butter projects, funding. I value and honor those who step up. I'm a product of East Los Angeles. As a little boy, I sold oranges door to door. Little would I know that I would end up representing the area and going to the same households years later. And I'm from a generation that questioned government. I'm from a generation that believed in government, that government had a role, that government could help people or hurt people. And in my generation, we saw both sides.
Thank you. Senator Murray, what do you see as some of the biggest misconceptions people have?
I think the biggest misperception is that politics and government are inaccessible. I remember when I first told a neighbor of mine that I was going to run for the assembly, they thought that that was the biggest pipe dream and pie in the sky thing that one could do. And that, once you are in it, you find out that people, elected officials, are out in their communities on a daily basis. And everyone has, if they're not answering the phone themselves, they've got some staffer who is assigned to take care of constituent issues. And even on the political side, you might think this, person who is exalted in a certain way is difficult, but I've never seen a politician turn down a volunteer at their campaign headquarters. So, politics is ultimately accessible. And, if you've ever walked down the street with somebody like Willie Brown or Nancy Pelosi, who are famous, you'll find that, they talk to people on the street just as you or I would. So politicians are accessible, and you can actually change government. I mean, the thing that I learned about government is that when somebody faces, when I'm faced with a rule or a law that I think is wrong or is contrary to, what I think the best interests are, instead of lamenting that fact, I try to figure out how many votes I need to change the law. Most people think of rules as these things which are solid and like a brick wall, and they are fluid and amorphous. And if you have enough votes, you can change just about anything. So, things are much more accessible than the public, and changeable than the public would perceive them to be.
Thank you. Well, all three of you have been involved in politics in one form or another for decades. Looking back, what is the biggest change you've seen in California government? Senator Polanco, let's start with you.
Oh, the diversity. Today, you have more Asian Americans than ever before. The same with the African American caucus. The Latino caucus today is now 39 members. Why is that important? It's not just about the numbers. Kevin touched upon when he got there, you were basically assigned to either the social welfare programs, and I don't say that to belittle them, but where the real important or even more important impact can be made is at the budget, in the appropriations. And so, I'm a firm believer that diversity matters. When Kevin did the bonds, I remember him coming and having conversation. Pocket parks today are a direct result of his insistence in controlling the agenda and taking part of a very active role and changing how the money was going to go and where. And so with the diversity today, California is going to become stronger. It's moving in that direction. It's going to continue to represent people of all walks of life, which is important because of the public policy. All of us bring a certain experience, and that experience matters, and it should be at the table and not on the menu. You want to be at the table, and we're seeing that in California, that's for sure.
Thank you. Senator Murray, what's the biggest change that you've seen?
I think, I would sort of co-sign on what Senator Polanco said. I think having people at the table with a variety of experiences, having people of ethnic minorities who are chair of the budget committee, chair of the appropriations committee, in the leadership meeting, it's kind of like that song from Hamilton, "In the Room Where It Happens." You got to be in the room in order to participate. Although one of the things that I bemoan, and I, at the risk of sounding like, the old get off my lawn man, it seems to be that things, even when you read about them, whether it's Sacramento or in Washington, they're much more transactional and strategic and less relationship based. There was a time when I could go down to Senator Polanco's office and say, "Hey, Richard, I got this thing. You might not be interested in it, but it's important to me." and he would say more than likely, yes, I'll support you, without asking for anything in the moment, but just anticipating that we had a relationship in which I would also be sympathetic to things that were important to him. And I just get the impression, again, 10 years removed, that it's much more transaction. When you read articles, when you talk to people, they more talk about the strategy of whatever it is they're trying to accomplish, rather than the idea of just having a relationship, as Assemblyman Mori mentioned, maybe with someone from across the aisle who has nothing to do with your issues and you have nothing to do with theirs, but you recognize that you need each other, and you just do it based upon a relationship. Hey, he or she is a good person and they have supported other things of mine in the past, so I give them the benefit of the doubt if it's not something that violates my principles. I don't see enough of that. I see mostly, maybe not transactional in the moment quid pro quo sense, but it feels more transactional to me.
Thank you. Assemblymember Mori, how about you? What's the biggest change that you've noticed from your time in government?
Well, I think there are a couple things I'd mention. If you look at Senator Polanco, he was a staffer before he was a senator. Is that right, Richard?
That's correct. That's correct.
And I went out knocking on doors for city councilman this last election here in Salt Lake City, and I had my phone with everything on my phone. It told me everything about every door I knocked on and who lived there. And, when I ran I just knocked on every door. I had no professional concept of what was going on. I just knocked on all doors. And so today, I think you find that elected officials are probably a little bit more professional and prepared for what they have to do. To be honest with you, I had never been to a committee meeting before I got elected. So, I get elected, I get down to Sacramento, I have to go to these committee meetings and learn what the whole process is all about. So I think political people are a lot more able and professional and know what they need to do getting into it. And of course, I would echo what they say about diversity. As I said, 2 Asian Americans in the assembly, none in the Senate at that time. There were, I don't know, Richard and Art and Peter Chacon, I think 3 or 4 Hispanics, Willie Brown, and a couple other African Americans. So just a handful. Today, I think the Asian caucus is 20 plus. Which is a big change from what it was back in those days. So, I think people are better prepared, and we're a little bit more diverse. And the other element of diverse is women. Just a handful of women in the state legislature when I was there. And I think there's a lot more engagement and involvement of women in the process.
There are more women in the Latino caucus than men.
Oh, really?
Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you both. I know we have questions that have been piling up, and I want to get to those. And maybe a place to start, Jennifer asked a question that often diversity is spoken about in terms of race, ethnicity, or gender. However, 40% of California's electorate is under the age of 40. Can you all speak to the importance of diversity in age as well?
Well,
ahead.
Being the oldest, people talk about our current candidates on a national level, that they're, getting into their 80s. But, there are a lot of people in our country that are getting into their 80s too. So I think diversity in age is very important and very critical. It's great to see some young people get elected. And, old people aren't that bad. They have experience, they have some wisdom, and, they've seen what's been going on over the years. And I think they may have something valuable to add to the whole process. So, I think the electorate needs to look at the person, and hopefully it reflects that particular area. Age diversity is very important because we need to serve all ages, not just certain people.
I was 34 when I first got elected, so I suppose I was definitely on the younger side at the time, and it certainly did give me a different perspective, and I was interested in different issues than maybe some older people had been. But I just want to emphasize it's not one or the other. I think you need the energy and perspective of young people, and you also need the wisdom and perspective of older people. And so, but the other thing that happens with politics is that some people sort of come up through politics, other people retire from some other thing and then decide to go into politics. So, politics is largely about showing up. I mean, you can't win an election unless you stand for an election. So I would certainly encourage more younger people to get involved and stand for office.
Hey, Kevin, I was 32 when I was first elected.
See, there you go.
Senator Polanco, do you have any response to the question?
The question being on diversity, does it go beyond just the political realm? Absolutely, age matters, and the experience of older folks is important. The presence of young, geographic representation also matters. Diversity is more than just a term. I mean, I view diversity as a commitment. Diversity on our boards of corporate America, where we lack diversity still on local governments, and so diversity is an important element to governing, and it must reflect in an equitable manner the population mix.
Thank you. We had a question, and that kind of hits on, I think, what Senator Mori was discussing about getting involved and being engaged in politics. And somebody was asking, what advice would you give to young people today who are interested in getting involved in politics? And Senator Mori, maybe we'll start with you.
Show up. It's really simple. Show up. Go to a campaign of somebody who you think you are aligned with, and volunteer on their campaign. And then you'll meet them, and you'll meet their staff, and you'll meet other people. And when that person wins, hopefully you pick the right candidate, then you'll have a shot at going to work for them on their staff. And then maybe you'll have an opportunity to run for office yourself. Or every almost, in the state legislature, at least, both bodies have fellowships. You can apply for those fellowships. You can also just, look at election results and see who's won and about to get sworn in, and go and say, I'd like to work for you. I don't know about you, Richard, but, many people just sort of applied to work in the office, either in Sacramento or in Los Angeles, in my case. And we hired them as, either policy people or district people. But you just got to show up, to the just like I mentioned before. We're always looking for people, particularly people who have an ability to connect with the community, or an ability to have expertise in some policy area. You just have to show up, and believe me, some legislature will take on your work.
Senator Polanco, any advice?
Don't be afraid. Don't let fear dictate and become your inability to engage in a process that matters, that makes a difference. For those who will follow the fellow, I termed out of office in 2002, and upon my retirement, I realized that we come and go with the term limits, and we needed to institutionalize the presence. And so we created the Latino Caucus Institute, a 501c3. And from there, we created a fellows program and an academy to train newly elected officials on how to govern, not how to run for office. They got elected, how to govern. The Latino Caucus in my last year, we commissioned a 5-year strategic plan, and the elements, the objectives were create an institute for research, create a fellows program, and the academy. The fellows program, I was honored, is named after my family, Polanco Fellows. We graduated 42. These are fully stipend opportunities, much along the fellowships that exist with the Assembly. I think by our certainly by the second or third year, we had more fellows in this program than the Assembly and Senate. And why is that important? Because in Sacramento, the public policy discussion, as I mentioned, we come and go as electeds, but to institutionalize the committee consultants, the principal consultants, the chiefs of staffs, the district directors, all of that matters. Rudy Salas is a graduate Polanco Fellow, first class. Esmeralda Soria, today Assemblywoman. We have chiefs of staffs, and again, it's to institutionalize the presence and the experience and contribution that ethnic minorities can bring in this great institution that I admire and love so much.
Thank you. Assemblymember Mori, any advice to those who are looking to get involved?
I'd say amen to both what the two senators have said, is to get engaged, be involved. Yes, show up, but get engaged and develop relationships. Not just be there, but develop personal relationships and get to know people that you admire in the process. And as is mentioned, there are many opportunities for fellowships and internships, not just in the legislature, but within organizations. There are a lot of civic organizations, civil rights organizations that have opportunity for fellowships. I spent 15 years in Washington, D.C., and that was one of the major things I did, was to bring fellows to Washington, D.C., place them, in my case, in congressional offices where they got a real firsthand knowledge of what was going on. And today, I see these now a little bit older people working in the White House, chief of staffs, doing things, elected offices, because they got engaged, they got involved, and they got developed relationships with the right kind of people. So yes, get involved and develop relationships.
We also had a question which was similar to one that I also had on my list, is all three of you were working in government during the days where reaching across the aisle and finding common ground was much more common than we see today. Given the current landscape of politics in our country, how do you see us moving forward and working together as a community, given so much divisiveness and partisanship? Let's see, Assemblymember Mori, maybe you want to start us off.
Sure. I mentioned fellowships and internships, and one of the advices I gave to these young people was, whatever political party you are and whatever politician you work for, find somebody on the other side of the aisle that you can develop a relationship with and be friends with and be trustful. And because you never know 20, 30 years into the future where that can be very, very helpful. But, I think inside it's not as bad as it appears to be from the outside. Even as polarized, for example, as the federal government seems to be today, we see some people working together and getting things done and putting, interests of their constituencies above personal political politics. Now, there are some that probably don't do that, but for the most part, I think outside of the headlines and in the back rooms and the back doors, people try to work with each other. And that that's the part of Washington, D.C. or Sacramento that we don't see. And I think it may not be as evident as it has been in the past, but hopefully it's still there and will continue to grow.
Senator Polanco, same question.
Yeah, it's all about relationship. It's all about being your word. It's about keeping your word. It's all about knowing that today you may be supportive of what I'm asking you to support, or not. But there's always another day. It's really never over in this process. And I can recall the time, once a year where Kurt Pringle would come to visit me, who was the minority leader, and go over some bills and say, here's what we're looking at. What do you think? Yes, no, okay. If not, okay, let's try to find a way. But it's all about relationship, being your word and keeping your word.
Senator Mori, your thought.
Yeah, I would co-sign, of course, on what both the gentlemen said. And I would also point out that while the high profile issues, which seem to be so intractable, they're about 10% of what you do in the legislature. Even in Congress, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of virtual unanimous votes of things that are non-controversial. And what you hear about is really just the controversial things. So it isn't as bad as the public perception, although I do think there is a scorched earth mentality. Here in California, the Democrats have essentially a supermajority, if not an outright supermajority. So you get much less of that. But what happens when you have a supermajority is, your supposed allies start to peel off from you because they don't think of themselves as important. But I think there will have to be some person who becomes a unifying person or a unifying choice to help sort of unify things. Otherwise, there just is this sort of scorched earth, everything my way or the highway kind of things. And, back in our day, and, I don't often get to say that back in our day, but more and more that's starting to happen. One of the reasons you compromised is because you didn't want the person to vote against, or you didn't want to lose something that was important to you. Now, for instance, there is a person in Congress now holding up every military appointment because they have one issue. So that there weren't too many one issue people, I think, in our day. And I think there will have to be somebody, maybe not a politician, but some leader who becomes a unifying force to get people to just soften it a little bit and be willing to listen to the other side.
Well, I think we have time for one more quick question before we turn it back over. And one of our audience members asked, what would you still like to see happen in the California legislature regarding diversity of legislators or otherwise? Senator Murray, let's start with you quickly.
That is actually the most difficult questions of the questions asked. I think that the legislature has evolved, particularly in terms of diversity over time. I just think that, going back to what's been said by everyone, is just the willingness to talk to another person who thinks a little bit different than you. So even though there is diverse ethnicity, now you are starting to see divisions within that ethnicity. So you might be an ethnic politician, maybe a Latino, but a Latino or a Latina from East LA is different than a Latina from Fresno or from Modesto. And so the willingness to think beyond yourself, not just ethnically, not just party. So like here in California, the things that used to be either ethnic or party-based are now geographic-based. So not only do you got to reach across the aisle, but I remember a guy named Mike Machado, if you remember Mike Machado, who was from Modesto, always asking me to vote for, bills on farm stuff, which of course I did. But it's because he reached not just across the aisle. He happened to be Portuguese, not just ethnic, but he was from Modesto in a farm community, and I'm from urban Los Angeles. And so you've got to come together and think about the entirety of the state. I think circling back to Secretary Weber's first comments is that we have just about everything. We're certainly Hollywood. We supply most of the food for this country. We have oil. We have all of these various interests. We have coastal interests. We have, farming valley interest on the other side. Water is a big issue. So, and it's a big issue for cities and for farmers. So there's a thing where everybody's got an issue that there is a benefit to the state if we solve them. So the earlier comment about thinking of diversity as more than ethnicity and even more than age, I would throw geography out there as something people ought to pay attention to.
Assembly Member Mori, what would you still like to see happen in the California legislature?
Well, I think a lot of it has been mentioned, but let me just go one step beyond just the legislature. When I came to the legislature, not only were there 2 Asians in the legislature, there were maybe 4 Asians on staff. And if we went to the agencies and heads of agencies and managers of agencies, there were none, basically. So I think we got to go beyond the legislature. The legislature is the beginning, but we need to see a lot more diversity in the operation of the legislature, meaning staff. We need more diversity and equity in terms of the staff in the state. For example, going way back to one example, the Korean community in Los Angeles were relatively new when I was elected. I didn't know a lot about the Korean community, but the labor department had some real problems in dealing with them because they couldn't speak English. So one of the things we did was to make sure that there were Korean speaking people within that agency to help these new business people get accustomed to and abide by the laws of California. So diversity goes beyond the legislature. It must be throughout the state.
Thank you. Senator Polanco, we're going to let you have the last word.
Rephrase the question, please.
What would you still like to see happen in the California legislature?
We need to resolve the water issue. There are too many urban and rural communities that lack water, that don't have water, and those that do is contaminated. It's a serious issue. It must be addressed in the non-traditional manner in which we've been accustomed to. It goes to new people at the table. The whole issue of closing the digital divide. We saw little girls having to go to a Taco Bell to get Wi-Fi. We need to ensure that underserved and non-served communities are reached. It's paramount. Without that in place, we'll continue. If we have another COVID outbreak, we're going to be in serious trouble. Those to me are 2 very important issues. Obviously, the homeless issue is of great concern. I believe that it's not about money. And I find myself, it's about really creating the accountability elements that I think have been missing. The voters and taxpayers, $1 billion in various kinds of support. And so homelessness, and then to the whole issue of housing. My God, in California, renters you can't afford a house. Renters are paying $2,000 to $3,000 for a 1-bedroom. That's a house mortgage payment. And so those are the challenges I think that California faces, and they cut across. You talk about diversity. There's disproportionately to these diverse communities. And I'll end it at that.
Well, thank you, all three of you, for your thoughts and time today. I'm going to turn it back over to Natalia.
Thank you. I just want to thank everyone who came to attend today's discussion. And of course, we want to thank the Honorable Kevin Mori, Honorable Richard Polanco, and Honorable Floyd Mori, as well as our moderator today, Dr. Todd Holmes, and the California Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Weber. And to all the team members that helped today make such a rich and fulfilling conversation. This has been amazing. The oral histories that we have collected will be available online and accessible through our website. And they're also currently available online at the Oral History Center at UC Berkeley. If you're interested or are curious about our collection here at the State Archives, and or want to come visit us, we are located at 1020 O Street in Sacramento, California. If you can't make it to us, or you just kind of want to hear more about future events like these, because this was just amazing today, our email is archivesevents@sos.ca.gov. I want to thank everybody again for coming, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.